I'm Alexandra Kreis, and you're listening to Outer Travel in a Journey. Journeying now for 30 years into the life and practice of yoga, I have met many who have taken interesting turns, went past extraordinary bumps, and reached unexpected places. People with whom I shared conversations about everyday struggles, intimate realizations, larger questions, ideas, and dreams. So today, I'm passing on the mic to one of them so we could hear and celebrate the wisdom in people's differences and experiences. Welcome to Outer Travel in a Journey. On my show today is Jator Pierre. Hello there.
Hello there.
How are you doing, Jator, today?
I'm enjoying the Danish summer and enjoying the sun.
Beautiful. So you heard that bit already about Jator. He is currently based in Denmark, where he works as a holistic health coach. So that's what we're going to talk about first. The very simplest question that everybody wants to know, including myself, why did you become a holistic health coach? What drove you to pick up that profession?
Yeah, I think originally when I was 15 years old, I was obese as a kid. And when I was 15, I started to get into nutrition in magazines and movement and weightlifting, etc. And that brought me to a place called the Czech Institute eventually about 10 years later in the United States, which is a deep dive into corrective holistic exercise kinesiology, as well as a deep dive into how the body functions and interacts with emotion, organs and glands, the microbiome. And that continued to spark my interest in terms of just human beings and human nature. And to be very honest, myself, I've always been very curious about myself and why I do what I do. And then that grew into a deep fascination with psychology and I guess what some would call spirituality, and understanding and exploring my shadow and my unhealed or unintegrated wounds or traumas, or looking at the repetitive patterns that show up in my life and how they continue to play out. And I got very curious about, well, there has to be more here that's unexplored or unturned over as a theme. And I just dove deeply into exploring all of my inner workings and still do. I'm completely fascinated by our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings. I'm completely fascinated by how we can carry so much of our past around with us and how we can project that out into every moment or every person or everything. I'm fascinated by why we repeat patterns and perceive ourselves to be stuck. I'm fascinated by fear and shame, and the fear of fear and the shame of shame fascinates me. And
can I just jump right in there?
Yeah, please.
We are in the fear of fear stage, we are in the deepest fear stage that was being manifested without wanting to become political here, but we're, if you're listening to this, maybe out of sync, but we're still, in the pandemic, the corona pandemic, and there's been a lot of kind of, in my eyes, fear-mongering around certain things and how we should, and shame around how we should feel around people that are dying. So I don't know, is this turning up currently in your work, as in noticing as people show up to your work with these kind of current related fears and shame?
Yeah, most definitely. And I'm really excited that you brought the topic up, the topic of the fear of death, and also making death wrong, almost like an unnatural process, and that birth and life is only what's celebrated, and how we're so ashamed of dying and afraid of dying, and how that drives so much of our medical perspective,
Mm,
uh, our taking care of what we believe taking care of other perspective is, and the idea of then giving ourselves away to make sure that other people don't die also facilitates a story that many of us play out in our lives, which is uh, I won't be myself so other people can like me.
absolutely. Wow. I mean, you're hitting one button after the other with me, because this is all I'm investigating and, helping people currently with, because it comes up. It seems to become, it seems to come up with everything we're going through. So coming back to that very question that I asked before, what do you teach, and how do you teach, and how do you coach, or how do you facilitate it? Can you talk a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah. Uh, well, I just got off a coaching session with a group of coaches a moment ago, and what we were sharing in there, we were having a session with somebody that um, carries, at least in my perspective, a lot of shame about self.
Mm,
Uh, the deepest shame of I'm afraid of who I am. I'm also afraid of who I am not, which creates a really interesting bind. And this person um, is extremely intellectually based and very, very good at linear story. So the session essentially was co-creating a space with him
mm,
to allow him to start to feel his emotions again, to start to feel his sensations again, to start to feel himself again, because he, in my projection, uses language and incessant speaking to make sure no one can touch him metaphorically, and so that he can't actually touch himself.
mm,
So the reason
mm,
why I bring this up as a session to kind of explore what I do, um, many of us have lost the self permission to even feel ourselves, our emotions, our experiences. Back to childhood, uh, many of us experienced shaming scenarios that some of us deem, it's easy to see overt shame. It's very hard to see subtle shame. And
mm,
so, an example of subtle shame would be uh, your child is crying and or throwing a tantrum, and
mm,
instead of getting close and meeting that child and saying it's okay that you're feeling what you're feeling,
mm,
I'm here and I'm here to support you through that. What many parents do is use a pacifier or try to distract or try to take away, because many parents have their own fear and shame about their emotions, feelings, and sensations.
mm,
So when they see the child expressing that, they need to shut that down because of what that means about them.
mm,
And then that just proliferates the situation. So back to this client, we spent an hour helping him find safety and security and refinding the permission to start to feel again without fear and shame of being feared and shamed by the outside world or the inside world.
mm. And how do you create such a container as an exercise? Because as you say, look, I come from a long background of yoga, and I think
Mm,
what yoga brought to me was, coming back into feeling and experiencing myself. And
mm,
little did I know in my 20s that that was what I needed. Um, if anything, like I think there's also the other extreme that people feel too much. I don't know whether that kind of reoccurs to you with the shame and fear kind of thing, like fear of exploring all these emotions. So yeah, the question was, like, what is the practical, on take then on the situation besides talking to it if somebody is so talkative,
Yeah, beautiful question. And I think, you're actually demonstrating part of the process. The process is often asking invitational questions, not pushing an agenda. And so most of my practice is about asking questions for clients to find their own answers. And so in this session, we invited some space of silence, of him bringing up some feelings that he was feeling when we first got on. I asked, well, what are you feeling right now? And he started to talk about confusion, out of balance, some fear. So we spent 7 minutes just dropping into fear, just closing our eyes and inviting in saturation and allowance of his fear. And then I asked him, after we went through that process, I asked him, what was his experience like? And he started to give voice to what was going on in terms of his body during feeling his fear. And he started to get then very precise and started to explain where he was feeling it. And I asked him another question. I said, do you notice how you're already using your language to stay away from your feelings? And that struck him. And then we paused in silence for about 20 minutes, where he closed his eyes and really sank into, I didn't invite that, he did that, and sank into himself, his body, his awareness, and moved out of his, my experience, his incessant talking to stay away from himself. And then when we moved out of that slowly, then we went into, I asked him an intuitive question, and I asked him to not think into this. I asked, would you be willing to tell me the first number that pops up when you felt the greatest amount of fear? He said 7 years old. I said, cool. And I experienced myself to be highly intuitive. I think all human beings are. I just think some people have shame about their intuitive nature, so they don't know they're intuitive. So I asked them, well, I got a hit. What was your experience like when your dad turned his back on you when you were 7 years old? And brought up a ton more emotion. And then we sat with that. And then we did some imagery around him reconnecting with his father and hearing his father's experiences and his father's emotions and his 7-year-old's experiences and his 7-year-old emotion, and slowly not bringing them together because the 7-year-old was still very untrusting of being even touched or being around his father. So we asked the 7-year-old, what's appropriate for your father to do? Can he touch you? No. Can he sit by your bed? Yes. And then we went through a process of doing some intentional work with his dad toward his 7-year-old that his 7-year-old was comfortable with. And at the end of the session, he said, I don't think I've ever had the permission to feel. And in that session, there's a lot of coaches, and as a theme, coaches think their job is to lead, to tell people what to do, and to be the guru or whatever. And in our practice, as what I do as a coach, it's invitational, and the client's leading. And he had never had the permission to allow himself to feel and be deeply in silence.
Yeah. It brings up so many layers, what you're talking about. The first question that appeared is like, how did we manage to fall apart as a society, as a smaller group of, like family, friends, to really shame us and make us so disconnected from everything that, we don't even feel our feelings anymore, but we became literally the rats in the rat race, like just chasing the next opportunity to be seen, then probably not experiencing this fully. And then on the other layer of, because you're men here, like, and I do talk to women coaches, and I talked to a woman coach before, as I said, we talked about intimacy and the ultimate kind of barrier in even, these smaller modules where women can integrate feelings faster, maybe because they do experience their emotions more often, like, and now you're coming as a male coach, and I mean that with all respect, and then noticing how men are so deprived and still, incarcerated almost with in these old-fashioned models of 1960s. I have to lead and I have to be strong and not feelings. This is like, wow, this is a whole, bouquet of conversation you're bringing up with that. Yeah, is that something you noticed yourself? Like, the first question, of course, is very kind of a long thought, like, how can we make that, and how did that happen in our society, even though we went through the revolution of the 60s, and still are coming back through the industrialization to become so shameful and fearful. What's your maybe we start with that one, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a small question.
No, come on, brew yourself another cup of tea, dear listener. We're in this now.
I will be the first to admit that is there's so many, I think, potential threads to that question. So I'll pick a couple. One thread that I see is the family of origin. I think our families of origin, one of the biggest challenges is many families function from a place of loyalty, and they function from a place of loyalty out of fear. You need to fit into the family value and be who I need you to be so that I can feel good about myself. Many parents, this probably get me in trouble. My experience of many parents that I coach, often parents have children to have someone to live through. And that is a level of emotional, can be a level of emotional, mental, spiritual, intuitive, and as we know, physical, inappropriate use of a child. And so when we have parents who are shame-based and fear-based and hurt having children, then it becomes very likely that the child will also learn fear-based and shame-based values and functioning, which then just proliferates the system. So from a family of origin perspective, it's a rare bird or a rare child who decides to go through consciously or gets introduced to the individuation process to break out of family values and learn to become their own person, not out of disrespect, but out of respect to the gift that the parents gave, which would be, from my perspective, DNA. And the gift to self of self-respect to look at your values, explore your values, and decide which one of these are even my values. Which one of these do I actually still subscribe to? And one thing I offer a lot of people to consider how attached they are to still being a child in their parents' presence is a very simple question. How many of you, when your parents are coming to visit, change the way that you live? Clean your house in a different way, hide things that you normally don't hide. That is all symbolic of the inner child in you that's still attached to meeting your parents' values and not representing self. And that becomes then a larger picture from origin, family of origin, into culture. It's not okay to be different. It's not okay to look at things in a different perspective. And because we're so shame and fear based, when we do share different perspective, or we do share different ways of thinking and being, that is usually attacked or shamed rather than having nuanced dialogue, because many of us learned as children out of loyalty to communicate in a very blaming and shaming and violent way. I don't know anyone on the planet that I've met that grew up in a household, except for the one that, you know, some of my friends and I are consciously doing with ourselves, our family, and our children, to move away from this blaming and shaming language in the household to this acknowledgement, understanding, respectful. And for me, respect is like what I say to my daughter all the time. You are as celebrated for your feelings when they're challenging, angry, rageful, hurtful, as you're just as celebrated there by me as when you're joyous, excited, and meeting my needs. Or today she goes to a Steiner school. She had a summer party, and I was working. And I wanted to go, and I also need to work. And my wife and daughter got home, and they were outside playing in the water hose and having a good time. So I finished my work and I went outside before getting on with you. And I know what it's like to be a child where a parent doesn't show up. She's 3.5, and most people say she doesn't even notice that. And I say, BS, she definitely notices that.
Yeah.
So when I saw her, I waited till I had her attention and we had eye contact. And then I kneeled down and looked at her in her eyes, and I said, I apologize for not being at your get together today. It was super important to me, and I had to work. And I promise the next time that we have that, I promise I will be there and acknowledge you in that way. So bringing that level of awareness and mindfulness and thoughtfulness and consciousness into our homes, I think is one reason why it doesn't change out here in society. And maybe it's cliche, but I think that's where it needs to start, is with conversations like this ourselves, and then not just having the conversation, but going home and implementing the practice with each other on a daily basis. And that seems to be where the big challenge is.
And that's where I also felt like where we also have an opportunity, because I know a lot of those listeners out there on my podcast, you know, they are embarking on the spiritual journey and spiritual journey to me is first the self-discovery, you know, like who am I? And then kind of to unfold that away from the things we do, but the connections we make, you know, and the inner connections we make. And so that is an opportunity if we're not afraid of kind of looking at the darkness in us, because a lot of us who kind of went onto the spiritual path, like, you know, I went there like 3 decades ago, you know, so that was to me, to quote the title of a book, you know, I was a light chaser, you know, and I was chasing away from the darkness in me, you know, I wanted to be a better person, not knowing why my emotions would upset my, you know, like, or the way I am my parents so much. We're coming back to that, you know, first educational and formative presence. And now I see that coming back to that the world has shifted in these kind of old-fashioned traditions of spirituality into new leaders, that are not afraid to look at the psychology findings like Jung. I mean, you talked about shadow work, so that's only 100 years old, but it's been underlying those spiritual paths that we watch other people going successfully because they become compassionate, open, and all inclusive of values of other people.
I love that.
And and the darkness, the shadow, as Jung calls it, is so included in the spiritual work. It's been described as asuras, as demons, as anything. If you look a little bit closer at it, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you listener or you Jator, maybe you have your own experiences there. It's been described, but never it's almost as, oh yeah, there will be a passage where it's difficult, but I'm going to jump over it, and then on the other side I find the light. And it's in those daily actions that you mentioned, I find that I really meet my shadow, as you call it, and my express truth, shame and fear, if anything.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, and I completely agree, which means we're right. And and I love the light chaser, the spiritual bypassing. I think sometimes which I've fallen prey to myself, looking into the light is also blinding. And when I'm outside in the world, in the darkest places where there are no lights, I get to see the brightest stars. And I got to a place of getting curious of why don't I want to look at these parts of me? And when I asked that question, eventually what came up is I must have some level of fear and shame that I'm hiding from, which is why I don't want to look. And so if I really want to know myself, I need to look as well where I don't want to look, because from my perspective, those parts of self are the parts of self that have been shamed and feared the most, who paradoxically need the most amount of acknowledgement, attention, hearing, understanding, working with, so that they can come to the light to be integrated, and so that we can become more whole. And my experience of that type of work, what I'm experiencing in myself, is more and more acceptance of all of these aspects of me. And as I'm learning to accept all of these aspects of me, even the parts of me that I'm afraid to learn to accept, that I want to hide from the outside world, that I want to hide from myself, as I start to acknowledge and work with those parts too, or play with those parts too, my level of compassion, respect, and empathy for myself grows. And that natural outpouring goes toward other people, no matter what their perspective is. And it's not I love that you said that jump. It's not I'm a light chaser and I'm jumping all over this shadow and just saying, I accept you as you are, everything is as it should be, blah, blah, blah. I get that. I get that desire, and it makes me salivate too. But authentically, I think to get there, we have to go through the trudge and the mud and the beauty in that, and to find that, so that we can really learn to understand and accept ourselves authentically, to then really, really speak the word of acceptance to someone else, not from here, but from here.
Yeah, he's pointing at the heart. Who's ever listening? He was pointing at the head and then at the heart. So we don't through thinking, but through feeling, which we started with in your example.
Yeah.
And it makes me aware of the old saying, if you imagine the world would be just sunshine, and there would be permanent sunshine, which is like chasing the light to me, what would the planet Earth look like? It wouldn't survive. It would need to be a different kind of place. And that we, because we close our eyes at night, we keep forgetting that it still exists, and we wake up to the daylight and the possibilities a lot of the time. And that is in the night we really kind of experience the deeper layers of us, even by dreaming. I don't know how much you're in, like you incorporate dream work in your coaching. But
I've done dream work. I'm not a dream work coach, but I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful work. And there's a famous psychologist, which I don't remember his name, but he said something like not exploring your dreams is a life half lived. So I definitely explore my dreams.
Yeah. And it's so, and if I look a lot at mythology these days, and if you're a particular European mythology, and there is always that story around the darkness, the heroine, the hero, they need to go and slay a dragon, go into the depths of water, you name it, to come up as the heroine or the hero, or the light or the awakened person. We can kind of extend that vocabulary, or as an like as a human being with integrity. That's what we're talking about, without using too much spiritual terminology for those who are not interested. But
I really appreciate that. One of the places that I found super helpful to my own kind of exploration of the shadow or the parts of self that we don't want to see was, interestingly enough, there was a Netflix documentary called, actually it wasn't on Netflix, it was on National Geographic or something like that, called One Strange Planet. And it was a 7 or 8 part series. And the documentary was a lot of kind of current science, but from an astronaut's perspective. And the really interesting thing about astronauts, which I've never considered, is that every astronaut, at least that, in this movie, have had this very similar experience of that when they've gone to space, it's actually shifted their entire consciousness, because when you can get out there, you're actually seeing how everything is interconnected and one and necessary, inclusive of the light and shadow, inclusive of death and life, inclusive of war and pain, inclusive of all of the turmoil that we deem on the planet, all has a beautiful purpose that continues the proliferation and expression of life in different ways. And seeing that was always a big moment for me of kind of shifting from this fully like good or bad or positive or negative, and really starting to look at things as necessary, to be curious about them, to be curious about myself and all of the natural interactions and intricacies that are happening inside of me in the same sense that happen on planet Earth or in the universe for that matter. And that was really helpful in softening to myself to be a part of that story. In a very interesting way. So I don't know why that came up, but I wanted to share it.
I absolutely love it, because I asked you about the practicality of kind of moving into your shadows, and the spiritual world is full of these sayings and pictures about, like, the light belongs to the darkness and the other way around, but you just brought it down into a really an example that we can all relate to these days, because we have the technology and we can access these movies to understand as well.
I thought it was cool too, because these astronauts, and it was astronauts, and it was very science based, which I thought was cool because that very kind of a linear perspective, for those people with that amount of linear rational thought to be able to actually fly to to the moon or whatever, takes a tremendous amount of linear thinking and rational thought to put it together.
Yeah.
In some sense, for those people to have this awakening process happen by just being exposed to seeing the planet from space. I mean, when I say it and when I think about it, I can feel a shift in my body. I can feel a lightening. And to see it from that perspective, and to watch all the intricacies of nature and the life and death cycle normalizes the life and death cycle. Oh, wait a second. There's been 5, I can't remember, global deaths on this planet, historically, at least what science can tell. And what that means from a scientific perspective is all life was wiped out on the planet 5 times, except for a little bit of life. And then that life has proliferated in a new way and created new stuff and new expressions. And then it got wiped out again and then came back. Every time there's a little bit of life left. I mean, that speaks so much to my experience of the spiritual journey of looking inside of myself, getting to know myself, the life and death cycle of that, the transmutation of pain and suffering into understanding and purpose. I mean, it's so cool. At least for me, it's so cool.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, and then I kind of immediately think about how individual lives we live in the Western world, where if we don't have a purpose, like if we don't see the purpose to our life, then there is no purpose, and we all chase a purpose, like, oh, I'm doing this for a purpose, but maybe it's just that we contribute to evolution by, collecting data or giving data into the stratosphere and into the unified field by living the life cycles we do, and that we have to go in order for the world to evolve, because evolution is everything that's going to happen ever, that idea of Sanda, the expression of expansion. Everything needs to expand, and then it contracts in order to expand new. So the 5 life cycles you talked about, or the 5 deaths, greater death, that was just contraction at a very part, for us to move forward.
I really appreciate what you shared. I think in some regard, it's one of the heaviest weights that people carry, and that is the belief that you're not on purpose. Mine's the opposite. Show me a human being who isn't on purpose. I don't think it's possible. Whether we perceive it as purposeful from our ego's perspective, I think, is another story. This will be an interesting statement for me. Someone who doesn't believe they are on purpose, the level of arrogance and self-righteousness and hidden shame that comes with that statement is amazing. That's like saying, it's literally saying, I disagree with the mind of God. I disagree with the mind of the universe. I'm not on purpose because I don't perceive that I am, based on my ego's agenda.
It's very refreshing to talk, I have to say. I could be here, I feel like we could fill hours with this conversation.
Totally. Super fun.
Oh my God. But I think we gave a little bit of taste of your kind of work, and I forgot to mention that you do actually have a company who coaches people in this holistic health coaching that is, as I understand now, based around pain, shame, and stories, false stories and beliefs. Is that right? Or
Yeah. As we're talking about here, from my perspective, it's all interconnected. So my main work with clients is on pain, shame, hidden shame, fear, and that type of work. Our company, though, has coaches that do that type of work, as well as do gut healing and lifestyle and sleep and movement. And I believe that's all part and parcel of the human experience, and is also important to be at least considered and acknowledged. And so we work with all of that, nutrition, but it's all driven from the place of what's going on in our mind and what's going on in our heart, and how we are getting in our own way. And I'll use the language of self-sabotage, which I really don't agree with self-sabotage as a language in itself. I believe self-sabotage is just a mechanism that another part of self is using to survive. So it's not actually sabotaging for me. It's more of a way of protecting and creating safety and security that isn't working out for us now, at least in the way that we want it to. So we do that kind of work with our clients, and my experience.
Maybe you want to, to get that one in, because some people don't like to read the show notes where you can get the links to his website, but can you just name the
yes.
the company?
Well, the company is Whole Being, and that is spelled HOLBEING.com, Whole Being. We're in the middle of growing, so that's the main site right now, but it's not fully complete. That's the site to our group coaching and our coaches and what we're building. Of course, I'm on Facebook as Jator Pierre. I'm on Instagram at Get Whole Healing, HOL, as my Instagram handle.
That's plenty. The rest needs to be looked up on the thank
cool.
you. Just not to have a long stream of www.
No problem.
But I interrupted you at that very point of where you talked about what you're doing, and the holistic part of it just came through, I think.
Yeah, I was going to share that. It sounds funny to say for me, because I'm guessing everyone says it's really transformative work. It's really beautiful work getting to know ourselves in the presence of others. It's really beautiful work co-creating space where we're learning to have permission to feel, express, and be ourselves again. It's really beautiful work to learn to set healthy limits and boundaries with the outside world. I think, from my perspective, one of the most spiritual things we can do is not to be a step rug, but to learn how to represent ourselves and learn how to set healthy limits and boundaries and be honest. I think that's an underrated spiritual virtue, and so is playfulness.
Yes, it is. And to be playful and okay with the dark parts of us. That's what I always kind of find when I do my own shadow work. It's like the playfulness around it. So what? Like I like that part very much. I don't want to be in a holistic body all the time. I like to do some things that are not so great for my body. I totally enjoy that.
Yeah.
I thrive on it, So yeah, there you go. And that's the playfulness and the balance. Yeah, and it's fun. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was a delightful afternoon for me. I hope for you too.
Yeah, for me as well. And I'm super thankful to have me on, and honored to be here. Thank you, sister.
And thank you, dear listener, for following us once more into the deep and darkness of ourselves and our souls and the possibilities that you can create for yourself. I think that's very clear now. You can create that and co-create that. You don't need to do that by yourself.
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. Bye for now. See you next time.